My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33, and I've spent 11 years catching six-figure fraud hidden inside loan documents before it ever reaches a courtroom. None of that training stopped my hands from going cold the moment David handed me the folder. "You'll keep your clothes, your car, and whatever you brought into this marriage," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Everything else stays with Mercer Development." 200 people had come to the Oglethorpe Club that night to watch us celebrate 7 years of marriage. Instead, they watched him hand me divorce papers over a 3-tier cake. Nobody would end up cutting. His assistant Priya had walked the leather portfolio to me, while David tapped his glass and made a toast about honesty. I hadn't even opened it yet. I was still holding it closed when he started narrating what was in it, like a man reading a closing statement to a room he already knew wouldn't argue with him. "It's clean, Claire. No lawyers dragging this through a courtroom. I'm doing this the decent way, in front of people who love us, so nobody can say later that I hid anything," he said. Hid. He looked directly at me when he said it, and something in my chest went very still, the way a file goes still right, before I find the number that doesn't belong. I opened the folder because 200 people were watching me not open it. Inside was a settlement agreement. My name, David's name, and a property schedule that listed the house on Whitmore. The house my mother had left me 8 months earlier, the house that had never once appeared on any joint mortgage. David and I held together. Whitmore Lane was mine, deeded, recorded clean, except the schedule in front of me listed it under marital assets, jointly held, with a line for my signature already highlighted in yellow. "This is my mother's house," I said. "It's our house, Claire. You know how these things get treated once a couple's been married this long." "I know exactly how these things get treated, David. I spent 11 years reading the fine print men, like you hope their wives never learn to read. At Mercer Family Thanksgivings, that career had a name his sisters used instead of my job title. Claire's paperwork thing, not a career, a thing. Something I did in a back office while David built actual buildings, closed actual deals, stood on actual rooftops, in a hard hat for the Savannah Business Journal. His mother once introduced me at Christmas as David's wife. She does something with contracts, in the tone she'd have used for someone who alphabetized spice racks. I'd let it go for years, told myself it didn't matter what his family called my work, as long as the work itself mattered. I had stopped 3 fraudulent refinances in the last decade alone, caught a forged power of attorney that would have cost an elderly widow her home, testified twice in civil court about signature dating. None of it meant anything at a Mercer table. At a Mercer table, I poured coffee and asked about David's quarter. Tonight, in the dress David had picked out himself. I was about to find out exactly how much that paperwork thing was worth. I thought about the closing I'd worked that same morning, a young couple buying their first house. The wife crying happy tears at the table, because 11 years of my career meant nobody could quietly cheat them out of it. I had built my whole professional life around the idea that people deserve to understand what they're signing before they sign it. I had just never imagined I'd need that skill at my own anniversary party, in heels, with a string quartet playing behind me like nothing in the room had changed. I didn't sign. Instead, I reached into my clutch for my phone, because 8 months of grief had trained my thumb to do one thing. Whenever my chest tightened like this, open the voicemail folder and press play on the message. I couldn't bring myself to delete. I hadn't meant to play it here. My thumb slipped on the volume, and the ballroom sound system, wired for the quartet, picked up the Bluetooth signal from my phone, the way it had all evening for the playlist. David's assistant controlled. My mother's voice filled the room. "Claire, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, something has happened that I hoped never would." Every conversation in that ballroom stopped at once. "If David ever asks you to sign anything involving the Whitmore house, don't sign it. Don't argue with him either. Just call Thomas Reed in the morning. He has the original documents. He'll know exactly what David tried to do." 200 faces turned toward David. David's face did something I had never seen it do in 7 years of marriage. It emptied out. Not confusion. Not embarrassment. Recognition. He knew exactly which documents my mother meant, and in that half-second of silence, so did I, even though I couldn't yet have told you what was in them. If you've ever had a room go quiet around you. At the exact moment you finally understood something you'd spent years refusing to see. Tell me in the comments, because that's the moment this story actually begins. David's business partner, Marcus, stood up so fast. His chair scraped the floor. His wife grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back down, but not before I caught the look on his face. Not shock, guilt. The specific guilt of a man who has known something for a while and hoped he'd never have to watch it land. David's mother was 3 tables away, one hand pressed flat against her chest, staring at me like I was the one who had done something wrong by owning a phone. I stood there in my 7th anniversary dress, holding a portfolio meant to quietly end my marriage in front of witnesses who would later call it amicable, and I thought about every Thanksgiving. I'd been told my work was a nice little thing I did. My nice little thing was the only reason I hadn't signed. Somewhere near the back doors, a man in a gray suit set down his drink and started walking toward our table. I didn't recognize him at first, not until he got close enough for the light to catch his face. Thomas Reed, my mother's attorney for years, a man who did not attend parties he wasn't invited to, and who had absolutely not been on our guest list. "Claire," he said, ignoring David entirely, "I need 5 minutes. Tonight." David found his voice. "Thomas, this is a private family celebration." "It stopped being private," Thomas said, still not looking at him. "The moment you put the Whitmore property on a marital asset schedule, I felt every closing I had ever worked line up in my head, like a column of numbers that finally balanced. 11 years of reading documents for a living, and I had almost signed one at my own anniversary dinner, without reading past the first page, because my husband had learned exactly which room, which crowd, and which grief to use against me. That was the part that landed hardest, standing there in heels that already hurt. Not the betrayal itself, the precision of it. David had chosen a night I'd be exhausted from hosting, a crowd I'd be too proud to argue in front of, and a week close enough to my mother's death that grief would still be doing half his work for him. He'd built the setup the way I build a closing file, line by line, time to the minute, designed so nobody in the room would ask the wrong question until it was too late to matter. He just hadn't planned on my mother building a file of her own, 8 months earlier, on the man he actually was. "David," I said, closing the portfolio without signing anything, "what did you do to my mother's file?" He didn't answer for the first time since I'd met him. David Mercer had absolutely nothing to say, and every person in that ballroom was watching him not say it. I looked down at the portfolio one more time, at the yellow highlighted line waiting for my signature, and I understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. The same clarity I get when a closing file finally makes sense at 2 in the morning. My mother hadn't spent her last months worrying about her jewelry, or her furniture, or who would get the good china. She had spent them building a file on my own husband. And she had made absolutely sure I would find it before I signed away the one thing she'd worked her whole life to leave me. Thomas set his hand lightly on my shoulder. "Come to my office at 9. Bring nothing. Sign nothing before then." I looked at David one last time before I turned to leave the party neither of us would ever get to finish. Priya was still standing there, holding the empty portfolio sleeve, not sure whether to follow David or me. David's mother hadn't moved from her chair. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes at all now, which told me more than anything he could have said out loud. "You picked a room full of witnesses to hand me this," I said. "I hope you remember that part, because I certainly will." David reached for my arm as I turned. "Claire, wait. Let's talk about this at home, like adults, not out here in front of." "You made it public, David." I kept my voice level, the same voice I use when I tell a loan officer their file has a problem they don't want to hear about. "You picked the room. I'm just the one who's leaving it." Behind me, the quartet had stopped playing entirely. Nobody had told them to. 200 people sat frozen around ivory tablecloths and a cake nobody would cut, watching a 7-year marriage end in real time, and not one of them said a word as I walked past the gift table toward the door. I didn't cry until I got to the parking lot. Even then, it wasn't grief. It was 11 years of training finally catching up to my own life, the same cold clarity I feel at 2 in the morning when a closing file stops making sense, and then, all at once, makes terrible sense. David hadn't planned a party. He had planned a closing. And for the first time in 7 years, I understood exactly which side of the table I'd been sitting on. By the time I got my car out of the valet line, my phone had already started buzzing. Not David. Marcus. Then David's mother. Then a number I didn't recognize with a Savannah area code, 3 times in a row. I let all of them go to voicemail. The way I let David's calls go straight through to a folder I wasn't ready to open yet, and drove home alone to a house that, as of tonight, apparently belonged to someone else's version of our marriage. Whatever my mother had found, she hadn't trusted it to a lawyer's letter or a phone call. She'd trusted it to a recording. Only I would think to play at exactly the wrong moment for David, and exactly the right one for me. Tomorrow at 9, I was going to find out what she knew. Thomas Reed's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The same smell it had smelled like every time I'd been there as a kid. Waiting in the lobby while my mother handled business. She never explained to me 9 sharp. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night sitting on the edge of my bed, still in my anniversary dress, staring at a wall, replaying the sound of 200 people not saying anything. Thomas didn't offer coffee. He set a banker's box on the desk between us and started pulling folders like he'd rehearsed the order. "Your mother came to me in February," he said, 6 months before she died. She wasn't well yet, but she was sharp. She sat exactly where you're sitting and told me. David had asked her to co-sign something for one of his projects, back when you two were still newly married. A personal guarantee on a construction loan for a strip of commercial lots on Baldwin Street. My mother co-signed a loan for David. No, Thomas slid a document across the desk. She refused. That's the point. Look at the signature line. I looked. Eleanor R. Bennett, in my mother's careful, forward-leaning handwriting. The same handwriting from 30 years of birthday cards, except my mother told me she'd never signed it. She said she remembered the meeting clearly. Thomas said. David brought the guarantee to her house for lunch. She read 3 pages of it, told him she wasn't comfortable putting her name on his company's debt, and sent him home without a signature. 2 years later, going through her safe deposit box, for unrelated reasons, she found a copy of that exact guarantee. Signed. My stomach did something I recognized from Closings Gone Wrong, a drop that starts under the ribs and spreads down through the hands. Forge. That's what she believed. She wasn't a document examiner, Claire. She didn't have your training. But she'd handled enough contracts in her real estate years to know her own signature, and this wasn't it. The pressure was wrong. The loop on the R was wrong. She brought it to me, instead of confronting David directly, because she didn't trust herself to stay calm, and because she wanted proof before she said a word to you. If you've ever had someone hand you evidence that rewrites a memory you thought you understood, you know exactly the feeling I had sitting in that office, watching 11 years of my career collide head-on with 8 months of grief I hadn't finished processing. I picked up the document myself. My hands did the thing they do at work, automatic, before my brain had caught up to what they were doing. I held the page at an angle to the window light, checking pen pressure, the way I check every questioned signature that crosses my desk. The pressure was heaviest on the downstroke of the E, lightest on the final N, a pattern that doesn't match a signature written in one continuous motion. It matches a signature traced from a reference copy. He traced it, I said quietly. He had a real signature of hers somewhere, probably off an old document, and he traced it onto this. Thomas nodded slowly. That was your mother's theory too. She just didn't have the vocabulary to prove it the way you just did in under a minute. I sat back. The chair creaked the same way it had when I was 9 years old, waiting for my mother to finish a meeting I wasn't allowed into. Here was the arithmetic, and it landed on me. The way a closing statement lands when the numbers finally add up to something ugly. David hadn't just forged my mother's signature 2 years into using it as collateral leverage on a project that had nothing to do with our marriage. He had gone back to that same well again, 8 months after she died, this time aiming the forgery at me directly, betting that grief would keep me from reading the fine print the way she had. He wasn't improvising at the anniversary party. He was running the same play twice, on 2 generations of the same family, and he'd only gotten caught the second time because the first woman he tried it on had spent her final months building a file to stop him. I thought about the mechanics of it. the part of my brain that never fully turns off, even in grief. A traced signature only works once, on one document, in one context, unless the person doing the tracing has access to a real signature every time they need it. That meant David hadn't forged my mother's name from a single stolen sample. He'd needed a source document with her signature on it, something recent enough that the ink and paper aged consistently with a construction loan guarantee, which meant he'd had access to something of hers, something he could go back to, more than once, without her knowing. "Did she keep documents at your house?" I asked Thomas. "Anything David could have had access to before your firm started holding her records?" "For a while. Before your father passed, before she moved everything to a safe deposit box. Some of her paperwork sat in a file cabinet at the house David built for the two of you. Your mother mentioned that specifically. She said it bothered her more than the forgery itself, that she might have made it easy for him without ever knowing. That detail sat in my chest like a stone. My mother hadn't just been betrayed by her son-in-law. She'd spent her final year quietly, wondering whether her own trust in her daughter's marriage had handed him the tools. "There's more," Thomas said. "The Baldwin Street guarantee wasn't the only document in that safe deposit box." He slid a second folder toward me, thinner than the first, and I noticed his hand wasn't quite steady when he did it, which told me before I opened it that whatever was inside mattered more than the forgery I'd already found. Inside was a property appraisal for Whitmore Lane, dated 4 months before my mother's death. Commissioned not by her, and not by me. Commissioned by Mercer Development Group. David had ordered an appraisal on my mother's house while she was still alive, months before I inherited it, months before any divorce, at a time when he had no legal claim to the property whatsoever. "He was pricing it," I said, "before she even died. He was pricing my mother's house like it was already his." "That's what your mother thought too," Thomas said. "It's the reason the tone of her voicemail changed the way it did. She wasn't just worried David might pressure you into something after her death. She believed he'd already started planning for it." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at an appraisal number that meant David had looked at my grieving mother's home and seen a line item on a spreadsheet before he'd seen anything else. If you've ever realized someone was quietly pricing your life before you'd finished living the part they were pricing, tell me in the comments, because that's exactly where this got personal for me. "What do you need from me?" I said, "to make this stick?" Thomas finally sat down across from me instead of standing over the desk. "Your professional opinion, documented and notarized, on both signatures. A forensic handwriting examiner will strengthen it further, but your initial read carries weight given your license, and I need you to think carefully before you answer my next question. Ask it, did David ever have you sign anything for Mercer Development? Anything at all, even something he called routine?" I opened my mouth to say no, out of instinct, the same instinct that had let me spend 7 years assuming my husband's paperwork was beneath my professional attention, because it was family, not a file. Then I remembered a Tuesday, 3 years earlier, David sliding a single page across our kitchen counter while I made dinner, telling me it was just an authorization, so his accountant could pull our joint tax transcripts for a refinance. I'd signed it without reading past the first line, the way I never let a client sign anything in my own office. I remembered the smell of onions on my hands, the pen he'd already uncapped and set beside the page, the way he'd kept talking about something else entirely, while I signed. A trick I recognized now for exactly what it was, because I use a version of it, myself, to keep nervous clients calm during closings. Keep them talking about something unrelated. Let their hand move before their attention catches up. He'd used my own professional instincts against me, 3 years before I ever needed to notice. My stomach dropped a second time. "There might be something," I said slowly. "I need to see it before I tell you what it actually says." Thomas didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had expected exactly this answer, and had been waiting patiently for me to remember it on my own. "Then that's where we start," he said. "Not with what David did to your mother. With what he's already done to you, and just never had a reason to use yet." I drove home from Thomas's office instead of going straight to work, which I never do, not once in 11 years, because a Bennett does not miss a closing over a personal crisis. but I sat in the driveway of the house. David and I had shared for 7 years, staring at the kitchen counter through the window, at the exact spot where I'd signed something without reading it, and I understood that the next document I looked at needed to be that one. I found it in an old accordion file in the hall closet, still in the same folder. I'd filed it under 3 years ago, back when I trusted my own husband's paperwork enough not to photograph it before signing, the one habit I break for no one else on earth. I read it standing in the hallway, still in yesterday's dress, and for the second time in 12 hours, my stomach dropped through the floor. It wasn't a tax authorization at all. It wasn't a tax authorization at all. It was a personal guarantee. My name printed at the top in David's assistant's careful font, tying my signature to a revolving line of credit for Mercer Development Group in the amount of $400,000. The date matched the Tuesday I remembered. The signature line matched my handwriting, because it was my handwriting, written by my own hand, under my own understanding, that I was authorizing an accountant to pull a tax transcript. I read it 3 times standing in that hallway before the numbers actually landed. $400,000. My name, personally liable on debt for a company I had never once been an officer of, never drawn a paycheck from, never sat in a single meeting for. If Mercer Development defaulted, and Thomas's box of documents suggested, it was closer to defaulting than David had ever let on. The bank could come after my personal assets to satisfy it, including Whitmore Lane, the moment it stopped being solely mine. I sat down on the hallway floor, still in the dress, and did the thing I do at closings when a client's face goes gray, and I need them to understand exactly what they're looking at. I broke it into numbers, because numbers don't lie to me the way people do. 7 years of marriage, 11 years of my own income going into a joint account. David controlled the spreadsheet for 3 separate years where I'd used my savings, the money I inherited from my father, to cover payroll gaps at Mercer Development during slow quarters, because David told me the company was 1 bad month from real trouble. And I believed him, because that's what a wife does. A guarantee I hadn't known I signed. An appraisal on my dead mother's house, commissioned before she was in the ground. I thought about the closing I did, just 3 weeks ago. A husband and wife refinancing together, both names on every document, both of them reading every page out loud to each other, at my table, before signing, laughing about it, teasing each other for being cautious. I remember thinking at the time that it was sweet, almost old-fashioned, 2 people treating a mortgage like a decision they were actually making together, instead of one signing, while the other watched the clock. I had never once done that with David. Not on the house, not on the guarantee, not on anything. I had built a career protecting strangers from exactly the blind trust I'd been extending my own husband for 7 straight years. I stopped calling it love somewhere in that hallway. I started calling it what my training would call it if a stranger's file crossed my desk with these same numbers in it. Exposure. If you've ever sat with a piece of paper and felt an entire relationship reorganize itself in your head, from a love story into a balance sheet, you already know exactly the floor I was sitting on. I thought about every year. David introduced me at industry events as his wife who handled the boring stuff. Every year I let him take the stage at Mercer Development's holiday party, while I stood near the back with the spouses. Every year I told myself the marriage was a partnership, even as every financial decision, every property, every guarantee, quietly accumulated on one side of a ledger that was never actually joint. I wasn't his partner. I was his infrastructure. The load-bearing wall, nobody photographs for the real estate listings, the thing that holds the roof up while somebody else stands in the doorway, accepting compliments on the view. My phone buzzed again. David, for the 11th time since the party. I didn't answer. Instead, I photographed the guarantee, both sides, time-stamped, the same way I'd photograph a question document for my own case file, and texted the images to Thomas Reed with 4 words. Found it. Call tomorrow. Then I did something I hadn't done in 11 years of protecting other people's paperwork. I stopped protecting mine from myself. I spent the rest of that day at my own office, not David's world, mine, the world where I actually know how systems work. I pulled everything I could legally access, as a licensed closing officer, without violating a single ethics rule I've spent a career enforcing. Public record filings on Mercer Development Group, UCC liens. The Baldwin Street parcel history. A commercial mortgage recorded 18 months ago that I had never once seen David mention, secured against 3 properties, one of which was listed under an LLC. I didn't recognize until I checked the registered agent. The registered agent was Priya, the assistant who had walked me the divorce portfolio at my own anniversary party, listed as managing member of an LLC, holding collateral for $400,000 of debt. I was personally guaranteeing. I looked at her name on the state filing for a long time. 26 years old, according to her LinkedIn, hired 18 months ago as an executive assistant, now sitting as managing member of an entity holding 3 commercial parcels. There is exactly one reason a business owner puts a young assistant's name on an LLC instead of his own, and it isn't trust, it's distance. David needed a name that wasn't his, wasn't mine, and wasn't easily traced back to Mercer Development if a bank or a court ever came looking. Priya likely had no idea what she'd actually signed either, which meant David hadn't just been willing to expose me. He'd been willing to expose anyone standing close enough to be useful. I sat back in my chair and let that arrange itself into a shape I recognized professionally before I let myself feel anything about it personally. David hadn't just been hiding a struggling business from me. He'd been restructuring it, quietly, moving risk onto my name and equity out from under it, into a name that wasn't mine and wasn't legally tied to our marriage at all. That's not a business decision a husband makes with his wife's future by accident. That's a plan. Around 4 in the afternoon, my coworker Diane knocked on my open office door, holding a stack of files I was supposed to review before Friday's closing. She took one look at my face and set the files down without a word, which is the kind of thing 11 years in the same office teaches people to do for each other. "You look like you found something you didn't want to find," she said. "I found the arithmetic," I said. "I just didn't want to be the one doing the math on my own marriage." She sat down across from me, the way I sit across from clients, twice a week, when a closing goes sideways at the last minute. "Then don't do it alone. That's not a rule. You'd let a client break. Don't break it for yourself. If you've ever caught yourself giving someone else advice you'd never once thought to take for yourself." That was the exact moment it hit me. I called Thomas back that evening instead of waiting for morning. I told him about the guarantee, about Priya's LLC, about the mortgage on Baldwin Street I'd found in 18 minutes using tools David had apparently assumed I'd never think to use against him. "You understand what this means," Thomas said carefully. "If David's moving assets ahead of a divorce filing, ahead of a business default, using your name as collateral cover, that's not just a bad marriage anymore." "I know what it is," I said. "I've spent 11 years writing up exactly this kind of file for other people's banks." "Then you understand why I need you to do something difficult before Friday." "What?" "I need you to go back to that house tonight, and I need you to find every original document David ever had you sign, before he realizes what you already know, and before he has a chance to make any of it disappear." I looked at the clock. 6:40. David would be home from the office within the hour, expecting either silence or an apology, whichever version of me had shown up broken enough after last night to give him one. He was about to get neither. "Tonight," I said, "before he gets home." I hung up, grabbed my car keys, and for the first time since the ballroom went quiet around me, I didn't feel like the woman standing frozen with a portfolio in her hands. I felt like the person my mother had spent her final months quietly training me to become. One voicemail, one hidden document, one careful silence at a time. The house was dark when I got there, David's car still gone. I let myself in through the garage the way I always do, and stood for a moment in the kitchen, where he'd handed me that Tuesday's authorization 3 years ago, the counter still holding the faint burn mark from a pan. I'd sat down too fast during dinner that same night, cooking while my hand signed away liability. I didn't understand I was accepting. I went straight for his home office, the one room in the house I'd never once needed a reason to enter, because for 7 years, I hadn't thought there was anything in it that concerned me. The filing cabinet was locked. I found the key exactly where I'd have hidden it myself, taped beneath the second drawer of his desk, because David has never once in his life imagined that I might look at his systems the way I look at everyone else's. Inside were folders labeled by project name, Baldwin Street, Whitmore Assessment, Riverside Phase 2. I photographed each one, page by page. My phone's camera flashed the only light in a house that suddenly felt like someone else's closing file rather than my home. The Whitmore Assessment folder held more than the appraisal. Thomas had already shown me. It held a draft quitclaim deed, unsigned. My name already typed into the grantor line, dated for a closing date 3 weeks in the future. David hadn't just been hoping I'd sign the settlement agreement at the party. He'd already scheduled the transaction that would follow it, banking on a signature he expected to get within days. I heard tires in the driveway at 8:15. Headlights swept across the office wall, sliding over the filing cabinet drawers I hadn't yet closed. I had 11 minutes of documents left to photograph, by my own estimate, and exactly the amount of nerve left to finish the job. Before he walked through that door and found his wife standing in his office with his own filing cabinet open, holding proof of every single thing he'd spent 2 years building behind her back. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else that night. I kept photographing. David found me standing in his office with the filing cabinet open. My phone still in my hand, the flash from my last photograph still ghosting across my vision. He didn't yell. That surprised me more than anything else that night. He just stood in the doorway in his work jacket, keys still in his hand, looking at the open drawers. The way a man looks at a closing statement he already knows he can't argue with. "How long have you been going through my files?" "About 40 minutes, I said. "Long enough. Claire, whatever you think you found." I found a personal guarantee with my signature on it for $400,000 of Mercer Development debt that you told me was a tax authorization. I set my phone down on his desk, screen still lit with the last photograph. I found a quitclaim claim deed with my name already typed into the grantor line, dated 3 weeks from now, for a house that isn't yours to sell. And I found an LLC registered to a 26-year-old assistant, holding 3 commercial parcels that used to be collateral on your own name, before you needed a name that wasn't yours. He set his keys down slowly on the console table by the door, the way people set things down when they're buying seconds to think. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The market on Baldwin Street collapsed 18 months ago. I was drowning, Claire. I did what I had to do to protect us. Protect us." I let the words sit in the room a second longer than he wanted them to. "You commissioned an appraisal on my mother's house 4 months before she died, David. She was still alive. She still had months left, and you were already pricing what you'd get if it became mine. That's not a man protecting his marriage. That's a man doing due diligence on an asset he was waiting to inherit through me." His jaw tightened, the muscle at the corner, working the way it always did right before he lost an argument he refused to admit he'd lost. "You forged my mother's signature 2 years before you did any of this to me." I kept my voice level, the same voice I use with a client who's about to hear a number they don't want to hear. "That's not protecting us. That's a pattern. And patterns don't stop on their own. They just find a new person to run on." Which is exactly what my mother told me the last time she ever spoke to me. David's face did the thing it had done at the party, the emptying out, except this time there was nowhere for 200 witnesses to catch it. Just me in his office, at 9 at night, holding a phone full of evidence he'd spent 2 years assuming I'd never think to look for. "What do you want?" he said finally. "Tell me what you want, and I'll do it." I thought about that question longer than he probably expected. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to be sure it was mine, and not something grief or anger was answering for me. "I want the divorce filed honestly," I said. "Real numbers, real disclosures, a forensic accountant looking at every account you've touched in the last 2 years. I want Whitmore Lane recorded as what it's always been, mine alone, with a formal release from any claim you've tried to attach to it. And I want you to call the bank yourself, before Thomas's office does it for you, and tell them exactly what's on that Baldwin Street collateral schedule. And if I don't, then Thomas has copies of everything I photographed tonight, time-stamped, alongside a documented handwriting analysis, showing my mother's signature on that construction. Guarantee was traced, not signed. You can spend the next 2 years fighting 2 separate cases, instead of settling one, David. I've read enough closing files to know which version costs you more." He didn't answer. For a second time in 2 days, David Mercer had nothing to say, and this time there wasn't a room full of guests to fill the silence for him. If you've ever had to choose between staying angry enough to burn something down or getting calm enough to actually win, you already know which one costs less in the long run. I didn't destroy David that night. I want to be honest about that, because it would have been easy, and some nights I still think about how easy it would have been. I had enough documentation sitting on my phone to end his business, his reputation, and very likely his freedom, depending on how a prosecutor felt about the Baldwin Street guarantee. What I actually did instead was hand everything to Thomas Reed and let the process my mother had already set in motion finish the way she'd designed it to finish, slowly, legally, without me having to be the one holding the match. The forensic accountant Thomas, hired, confirmed what I'd already found in 18 minutes on public record. Mercer Development had been insolvent for the better part of a year, propped up by a rotating series of guarantees David had gathered from anyone whose name he could still borrow. My mother's, forged, mine, real, obtained under a lie. Priya's obtained the same way, though I later learned she cooperated fully, once she understood what she'd actually signed, which told me she was another person David had used, not another person working against me. David's attorney tried, once, to argue that I had willingly signed the guarantee and should be treated as a knowing party to the company's debt. Thomas answered that with a single line in his response letter, one I keep a copy of, because it's the closest thing I have to a professional epitaph for my marriage. A signature obtained through active deception about the nature of the document is not consent. It is theft with a witness. The bank's attorneys, once they saw the pattern across 3 separate guarantees, moved fast to distance themselves from any claim against my personal assets. Nobody wants to be the lender who profited from a documented forgery once it's sitting in front of a judge. The house on Baldwin Street sold at a loss 6 months later to cover the worst of the debt. David sold his interest in the remaining Mercer Development assets to a partner, willing to take on the liability in exchange for controlling stake, which meant the company he'd built his entire identity around no longer had his name attached to the decisions that mattered. He kept his freedom. He didn't keep much else. I kept Whitmore Lane. I moved in 8 months after the party, on what would have been my mother's birthday, and spent the first weekend clearing out the file cabinet in what used to be her study. The same kind of cabinet. David kept his own secrets in, except everything in hers was labeled, dated, and exactly where she'd said it would be. Neighbors down the street still remembered her, from her real estate days, and one of them, an older woman named Josephine, who'd known my mother 30 years, stopped by that first weekend with a casserole and a story about the time Eleanor caught a title company trying to shortchange a widow on a closing back in the 90s. Your mother never let a number slide past her that didn't add up, Josephine told me on the porch. Not once, not for anybody. I always figured that's where you got it from. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I'd always assumed my career was something I built entirely on my own, separate from her, a life she didn't fully understand. Standing on that porch, I understood for the first time that she'd handed me the instinct decades before she ever needed me to use it against her own son-in-law. I found the original construction guarantee in the very back, the real one, the one where she'd written across the bottom, in her own steady hand. I told him no in writing, so there's no confusion later. She'd kept a copy of her refusal for 2 years, before she ever found out. He'd traced her signature onto a version that said yes. That's the part I think about most. Honestly, not the forgery, the refusal that came before it. My mother had said no to David clearly, on paper, with a date on it, and he'd gone around her anyway. She hadn't been careless. She'd been careful, and he'd erased the evidence of her carefulness because it was inconvenient to what he wanted. I started keeping copies of everything after that. Every document I sign now, personal or professional, gets photographed before it leaves my hand, time-stamped, filed somewhere. David could never reach even if he wanted to. Not because I think every person in my life is David. Because my mother taught me, 8 months too late for me to thank her properly, that the difference between being protected and being exposed usually comes down to whether you kept your own copy. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever handed someone your trust, the way I handed David mine, subscribe and stay for the next one, because there's a version of this story in almost every family, and most of the women living it don't get a voicemail warning them in time. I almost didn't either. 6 months after the divorce was final, I sat across from a client at my own closing table, a woman about my age, going through a refinance with a husband who kept answering every question before she could finish reading it herself. I did something I'd never done before at that table. I set my pen down, looked at her directly, and asked her to read the next page out loud, just to herself before she signed it. She looked surprised. Her husband looked irritated. I didn't care about either reaction. Take your time, I told her. It's your name on the line, not his. You're allowed to actually read it before you decide. She read it slowly, all the way through, and found a clause neither of them had noticed. One that would have cost her personally if the refinance ever went sideways. Small thing, fixable in 10 minutes with a corrected addendum. But it was hers to catch, because, for once, somebody had given her the time to look. Her husband asked me afterward, a little sharply, whether I always slowed clients down like that. I told him the truth. No, only the ones I recognize. My mother never got to see the woman I became after that voicemail. But I think she'd have recognized her immediately, sitting at that closing table, refusing to let another woman sign her name to something she hadn't fully read. That was never really about the house on Whitmore Lane. It was about learning, 11 years into a career built on protecting strangers, that I was finally allowed to protect myself the exact same way.